The desert that remembers. Before the sun has fully risen, the desert is almost silent. In the southern reaches of Peru, where the land stretches wide and bare beneath an immense sky, the air holds a cool stillness that feels older than memory itself. The Nazca Desert lies motionless, its surface a muted palette of rust, ochre, and pale stone. There are no trees to sway, no rivers to murmur, only the faint whisper of wind brushing across gravel and the distant cry of a bird passing overhead. You might be standing here now, feeling the ground firm beneath your feet, unaware that you are surrounded by one of the world's most enduring enigmas. At first glance, the desert seems empty, featureless, a place forgotten by time. But as the light strengthens and the shadows soften, something subtle begins to reveal itself. Straight lines emerge so faint they could be mistaken for natural cracks in the earth. Then angles, then curves. Slowly, patiently, the desert offers hints of intention. From the ground, these marks are difficult to understand. They stretch on and disappear into the distance, too large to grasp, too understated to demand attention. It is only when you rise above the land, when the desert becomes a canvas seen from the sky, that the true scale of the mystery comes into view. Lines that run for kilometers without wavering, shapes that form animals, plants, and symbols, designs so vast that they can only be fully seen from far above the earth. These are the Nazca Lines. They have rested here for nearly 2,000 years, etched into the desert floor by people who never left behind written explanations. No inscriptions, no records, no instructions, only silence preserved by one of the driest climates on the planet. And it is this silence that makes the Nazca Lines so compelling. The desert itself plays a role in the mystery. Rain falls here so rarely that centuries can pass without erosion. The wind is gentle, almost respectful. The stones on the surface, darkened by oxidation over time, protect the lighter soil beneath. When those stones are moved aside, pale lines appear, remaining visible for generations. The Nazca Desert does not easily forget. As you imagine drifting higher above the land, the scale of what lies below becomes clearer. A hummingbird frozen in flight, a spider stretching its legs across the plain, a monkey with a spiral tail, perfectly proportioned, astonishingly precise, and impossibly large. And yet these are only part of the story. Most of the Nazca Lines are not pictures at all. They are long, straight paths, trapezoids, zigzags, endless lines that cross one another, sometimes leading nowhere in particular, or perhaps leading somewhere no one has yet fully understood. For generations, these markings remained unnoticed by the outside world. Travelers crossed the desert on foot, their eyes fixed on the horizon. The lines were simply too large, too quiet to announce themselves. They waited patiently, hidden in plain sight. It was only in the early 20th century, when humans took to the skies, that the desert finally revealed what it had been holding. Pilots flying over southern Peru began to notice strange shapes etched into the earth below. At first, they seemed impossible. How could such enormous designs exist without being noticed before? Who could have made them, and why? As word spread, scholars, archaeologists, and explorers turned their attention to the Nazca Desert. What they found challenged assumptions about ancient societies, technology, and human intention. But discovery did not bring clarity. Instead, it deepened the mystery. Because the more carefully the lines were studied, the more questions emerged. The Nazca people who created them lived centuries before modern tools. They had no access to flight, no metal instruments, no written language to explain their work. And yet the lines display an understanding of geometry, scale, and planning that seems extraordinary even today. Standing here imagining the heat of midday now replacing the cool of dawn, it becomes clear that this was not accidental work. Each line was deliberately placed, each shape carefully proportioned. Nothing about the Nazca Lines suggests randomness or improvisation. They are purposeful, but purpose alone does not explain meaning. Why create designs so large they cannot be seen from the ground? Why expend energy shaping a landscape rather than building monuments that rise upward, like pyramids or temples? Why choose the desert, a place associated with absence and survival, as the medium for expression? These questions have lingered for decades, drawing researchers from disciplines as varied as archaeology, astronomy, anthropology, and environmental science. Each field brings its own tools and interpretations. Each offers partial insight. None provide a complete answer. And perhaps that is part of what gives the Nazca Lines their enduring power. They exist at the intersection of art and ritual science and belief landscape and memory. They are neither purely functional nor purely symbolic, or perhaps they are both at once. As the sun climbs higher, the desert grows warmer, the light more unforgiving. Shadows shrink, flattening the terrain. From this vantage, the lines seem almost fragile, as though they could vanish with a single careless step. Yet they have endured earthquakes, El Niño rains, centuries of neglect. Even now they remain largely unchanged, holding their form as quietly as they always have. This endurance suggests intention beyond the moment. Whatever the Nazca people hoped to achieve, they were thinking not only of their present, but of a future they would never see. A message meant to last, and still the desert does not speak. It does not tell us whether these lines were prayers traced into the earth pathways for ritual movement markers of water and survival, or symbolic bridges between the human world and the sky above. It offers no single explanation, no final revelation. Instead, it invites patience. To understand the Nazca Lines, one must first understand the people who lived here, their fears, their hopes, and their relationship with a land that offered little and demanded much. One must listen not only to scientific data, but to the rhythms of ancient life shaped by drought belief and community. In the quiet of the desert where time feels suspended, the Nazca Lines remain what they have always been, a reminder that human beings have long sought to leave meaning behind, even when they knew they would not be there to explain it. As the day advances and the heat settles in the lines, fade once more into the landscape barely visible from the ground. They return to their silence waiting, and so we begin not with answers, but with presence, with the desert that remembers. In the next part, we will step back in time away from the lines themselves and into the lives of the people who created them, exploring who the Nazca were, how they survived here, and what kind of world gave rise to one of history's most enduring mysteries. For now, the desert rests, and the lines remain. Before the lines, the world of the Nazca people. Long before the lines appeared upon the desert floor, long before shapes stretched across the plains in silence, people were already living here. You might imagine the Nazca Desert as empty and unforgiving, a place unsuitable for long-term settlement. And yet nearly 2,000 years ago, communities thrived along its edges. They learned to read the land with care, to understand its rhythms, its dangers, and its rare gifts. The Nazca people did not conquer the desert. They adapted to it. Their world unfolded between roughly 100 BCE and 800 CE along the southern coast of what is now Peru. Here, narrow river valleys cut through arid plains, carrying seasonal water from the Andes to the Pacific. These rivers were lifelines. Without them, survival would have been impossible. The Nazca built their settlements near these fragile sources of water. Villages clustered where crops could grow, where cotton, maize, beans, and squash could be coaxed from the soil. Life revolved around irrigation channels, careful planting, and constant vigilance against drought. Water was not simply a resource, it was sacred. To live here was to understand scarcity. Rain might fail for years at a time. Rivers could run dry without warning. In such a landscape, every aspect of culture, belief, ritual, art became intertwined with the forces that sustained life. The Nazca left no written records. Everything we know about them comes from what they made and what they left behind. And what they left behind speaks quietly, but with remarkable clarity. Their pottery is among the most vivid in the ancient world. Bowls and jars painted in deep reds, yellows, blues, and blacks depict animals, plants, and mythic beings. Some figures appear human, others partly transformed faces, merging with wings, hands holding severed heads, eyes wide and unblinking. These images were not decoration alone. They were expressions of belief, identity, and the unseen world. Textiles, too, reveal extraordinary skill. Woven from cotton and camelid fibers, Nazca fabrics display complex patterns and vibrant color, preserved by the same dry conditions that protected the desert lines. These textiles were often used in ceremonial contexts, wrapped around the dead, or worn during ritual events. From these objects, archaeologists have pieced together a society deeply concerned with cycles of water, fertility, life, and death. Religion among the Nazca was not centralized in grand temples or monumental architecture. Instead, it was woven into daily life and the surrounding landscape. Hills, valleys, and open spaces all carried meaning. The natural world was alive with spiritual presence. Ceremonial centers, such as Skywatching, played an important role. Located near the Nazca River, Skywatching was not a city in the traditional sense. It was a gathering place, a site for rituals, feasting, and pilgrimage. People traveled there from surrounding regions, bringing offerings, pottery, and textiles, participating in events tied to agricultural cycles and communal belief. And yet even Skywatching does not dominate the landscape the way other ancient centers do. It rises gently, built of adobe, blending into its surroundings rather than towering above them. This preference for subtlety, this avoidance of vertical monumentality, will later echo in the Nazca Lines themselves. The Nazca worldview emphasized connection rather than domination. Humans, animal spirits, and the land were interwoven. Transformation was a recurring theme. Many artistic motifs suggest movement between states of being human to animal living, to ancestral, earthly to divine. Death was not an end, but a passage. Burials reveal careful preparation. Bodies were wrapped in layers of textiles accompanied by pottery and offerings. The dead were placed in seated positions facing inward, as if continuing to participate in the community even after life had passed. Within this belief system, ritual was not separate from survival. Appeasing forces beyond human control, rain fertility health was essential. Ceremonies were acts of balance meant to maintain harmony between people and the unseen powers that shaped their world. It is within this cultural and spiritual framework that the Nazca Lines must be understood. They did not emerge from isolation or whim. They emerged from a society accustomed to expressing meaning through symbols, movement, and landscape. Importantly, the Nazca were not the first people to mark the land in this region. Earlier cultures, such as the Paracas, had already begun experimenting with geoglyphs, large ground drawings on nearby hillsides. These earlier designs were often visible from below, carved into slopes where they could be seen from settlements. The Nazca inherited this tradition and transformed it. Rather than placing their designs on hills, they moved them onto the open desert floor. Rather than making them easily visible, they made them immense, subtle, demanding a different perspective. This shift raises profound questions. Why change the location? Why expand the scale so dramatically? Why create symbols that resisted ordinary viewing? The answers are not obvious, but they suggest intentional evolution rather than accident. The Nazca were building upon ideas already present in their culture, refining and expanding them in response to changing needs, beliefs, or environmental pressures. The desert itself became a participant in this expression. Its vast emptiness offered space without boundaries. Its dryness preserved what was placed upon it. Its silence amplified meaning. As you imagine standing among the Nazca people, you might sense how deeply they listened to their environment. The wind carried dust and memory. The ground held stories. Every mark left behind mattered. They were not unaware of the challenges they faced. Drought intensified toward the later centuries of Nazca history. Environmental stress likely reshaped social structures, religious practices, and ultimately the fate of the civilization itself. Yet before decline came creation. At some point, perhaps gradually, perhaps in response to specific pressures, the Nazca began to draw upon the desert floor in ways no one had before. Lines were extended, shapes were refined, pathways crossed one another in careful alignment. This was not the work of a single generation. It unfolded over centuries, guided by shared understanding and cultural memory. To grasp the mystery of the Nazca Lines, one must first accept that they were created by people who were neither primitive nor careless. They were thoughtful, skilled, deeply symbolic, and profoundly aware of the forces shaping their existence. They lived close to uncertainty, and in response they turned the land itself into expression. In the next part, we will witness the moment when the modern world first became aware of these markings, when flight revealed what the ground had hidden, and the Nazca Lines stepped out of silence and into global curiosity. But for now, we remain with the people themselves. Their world was harsh, fragile, and beautiful, and it gave rise to something that still waits for understanding. First glimpses from the sky. For centuries, the desert kept its secret. Travelers crossed the plains on foot, their eyes fixed on distant hills and the shimmering horizon. Traders followed ancient routes, caravans moving slowly across the hard-packed earth. Even the Nazca people themselves who created the lines experienced them not as images, but as places, paths beneath their feet, spaces of movement and ritual. From the ground, the designs resisted recognition. They did not rise, they did not announce themselves. They remained quiet, stretched thin across the desert floor, merging with stone and dust. And so generation after generation passed without ever fully seeing what lay beneath them. It was only when humans learned to fly that the desert finally revealed what it had been holding. In the early decades of the 20th century, airplanes began crossing the skies above southern Peru. Pilots navigating long routes along the Pacific coast occasionally glanced down at the landscape below. What they noticed at first made little sense. Strange lines appeared in the desert, unnaturally straight, extending farther than the eye could easily follow. Then came shapes, curves, forms that seemed intentional yet impossibly large. At first, these sightings were treated as curiosities, visual illusions perhaps. The desert heat was known to distort perception. But as more pilots reported the same markings, it became clear that something unusual lay below. The Nazca Lines had waited patiently for this moment. News of the strange desert markings reached archaeologists and researchers, many of whom were already working in Peru. When they traveled to the region and viewed the lines from elevated positions, nearby hills ridges, and eventually from aircraft themselves, the scale of the discovery became undeniable. The desert was not empty. It was inscribed. Among the earliest scholars to take notice was Toribio Mejia Cespe, a Peruvian archaeologist who in the 1920s began documenting ancient pathways in the region. From the ground he identified long straight lines that appeared to be intentional, but even he could not yet grasp their full form. That understanding required height. As aviation technology advanced, aerial photography allowed researchers to capture images of the desert from above. For the first time, the lines could be seen as complete figures, animals, plants, and abstract forms laid out across kilometers of open land. The effect was startling. Here were designs that seemed to defy their own context. They were too large to be appreciated by those who made them, at least in any ordinary way. They were too precise to be accidental, and they were too numerous to be dismissed as isolated expressions. The modern world was confronted with a puzzle it had never expected. Who had made these lines? When and for what purpose? Initial reactions varied. Some early observers assumed the lines were remnants of ancient roads or irrigation systems. Others believed they marked territory or boundaries. But these explanations quickly fell short. Roads do not form hummingbirds. Irrigation channels do not spiral into perfect curves. As more figures were identified, skepticism gave way to fascination. By the 1930s and 1940s, the Nazca Lines had begun to attract international attention. Scholars from Europe and North America joined Peruvian researchers, bringing new tools and perspectives. Measurements were taken, maps were drawn, hypotheses were proposed and challenged. And still the lines refused to yield a single satisfying explanation. One of the most striking aspects of the discovery was how vulnerable the lines suddenly appeared. From the air, their beauty was undeniable. But researchers quickly realized how fragile they were. A single vehicle crossing the desert could erase centuries of work in moments. This realization marked a turning point. What had once been invisible now required protection. As awareness grew, so did the urgency to understand the lines before they were damaged or lost. The desert that had preserved them so perfectly now faced new threats from roads development and unintentional harm. But understanding proved elusive. Aerial views answered one question only to raise many more. Why were some figures clustered while others stood alone? Why did straight lines intersect images without regard for form? Why did newer lines sometimes cross older ones, suggesting a long and evolving tradition? Patterns emerged, but they did not resolve into clarity. Some figures appeared carefully proportioned, while others seemed more abstract. Some lines pointed toward distant mountains. Others terminated abruptly, as if unfinished. The desert became a layered archive recording centuries of decisions without explanation. The Nazca Lines had entered the modern imagination not as ruins, but as questions. They challenged assumptions about ancient capability. The people who created them had no access to aerial views, yet they designed works best seen from the sky. This contradiction unsettled early researchers and fueled speculation. But careful scholars resisted dramatic conclusions. They returned again and again to the same principle: these lines were made by humans using human means within a specific cultural and environmental context. The mystery was not how they were made, it was why. As you imagine drifting above the desert now, the lines no longer feel accidental or hidden. They feel deliberate, placed with care, aligned with intention, and preserved by chance. They stretch across the land like a quiet conversation between past and present. What once belonged only to those who walked the desert now belongs to the world. Yet despite decades of study, the Nazca Lines have not surrendered their meaning. Aerial discovery gave us vision, but not understanding. Seeing the lines did not explain them. It only revealed how much there was to explain. And so the desert continues to ask for patience. In the next part, we will move closer to the ground once more. We will explore how the Nazca people physically created these immense designs without flight, without metal tools, and without leaving behind written instruction. The mystery does not lie in impossibility. It lies in intention. Drawing on the desert floor. The desert looks different when you stand upon it. Up close, the Nazca plain is not smooth or soft, but firm beneath your feet, covered in countless small stones darkened by centuries of sun and wind. The ground crunches gently when disturbed each step, producing a muted sound that quickly fades into the still air. There is nothing fragile here at first glance, nothing that suggests this surface could be shaped into something lasting. And yet this is exactly where the Nazca people chose to work. To understand how the lines were made, one must let go of the idea of mystery as something magical or unreachable. The methods once carefully studied reveal patience rather than spectacle, simplicity rather than advanced technology. The achievement lies not in complexity of tools, but in clarity of intention. The desert floor consists of two distinct layers. On top rests a dark blanket of oxidized stones weathered by time into deep reds and browns. Beneath them lies a much lighter soil, almost pale yellow-white in contrast. When the darker stones are moved aside, the lighter ground beneath is revealed instantly, forming a visible line. This contrast is the foundation of every Nazca geoglyph. The Nazca people did not carve into stone. They did not dig deeply. They simply cleared the surface, sweeping aside rocks with their hands, wooden tools, and simple implements made from bone or stone. The result was immediate and striking, and crucially durable. Because rainfall in the Nazca Desert is extraordinarily rare, these cleared paths did not refill with sediment. The lines remained exposed, preserved by the same dryness that made life so difficult for the people who lived here. Archaeologists have recreated this process many times. Using replicas of ancient tools, researchers have demonstrated that straight lines, curves, and even complex figures can be laid out with remarkable accuracy using ropes, stakes, and basic surveying techniques. A single straight line might begin with two wooden stakes placed at distant points. A rope pulled taut between them would guide the clearing process. Step by step, stone by stone, the line would emerge, extending across the desert with steady precision. Curves and figures required more planning, but not impossibility. Small-scale designs could be sketched on the ground first. Measurements could be counted by footsteps. Proportions could be scaled up gradually using reference points placed carefully across the plane. This work did not demand speed. It demanded time, and time for the Nazca was something ritual already understood. Many of the lines are astonishingly straight, deviating only slightly over distances of several kilometers. This precision has often been mistaken for evidence of advanced technology, but in reality, it speaks to disciplined repetition and communal effort. The Nazca did not need to see the entire figure at once. They needed only to know where each segment belonged. Just as a weaver does not see the finished textile in a single thread, the makers of the lines trusted a shared plan. Each person clearing stones was participating in something larger than themselves, even if they could never fully view it. This raises an important question. If the lines could not be easily seen from the ground, for whom were they made? But before meaning, there is movement. Many of the straight lines show signs of repeated walking. The ground is compacted, smoothed by countless footsteps. These were not lines meant only to be seen. They were lines meant to be used. Some stretch directly toward distant hills or mountains. Others intersect in patterns that seem deliberate rather than random. The desert floor becomes a network, a system of paths and spaces, rather than isolated drawings. In some places, newer lines cross older ones, indicating that the practice continued for generations. The desert was not filled all at once. It was shaped slowly, layer by layer, decision by decision. Importantly, the Nazca did not erase what came before. They built alongside it. This suggests continuity rather than rupture, a living tradition rather than a single monumental project. The scale of labor also tells a story. Creating the lines required cooperation. Groups had to plan, measure, clear, and maintain these spaces. This was not the work of individuals acting alone. It was collective, embedded in social and ritual life. And yet, despite their effort, the Nazca left no permanent structures near most of the lines. No temples, no markers, no inscriptions explaining their purpose. The lines were the act itself. Once completed, they needed no further explanation. This absence of explanation is unsettling to modern sensibilities. We expect monuments to declare their meaning to commemorate rulers, victories, or events. The Nazca lines do none of these things. They do not celebrate individuals. They do not record dates. They do not tell stories in a linear way. They simply exist. And perhaps that was enough. The environment played an essential role in shaping this choice. In a landscape where resources were scarce, vertical monuments would have been costly and vulnerable. The desert floor, by contrast, offered vast space at minimal material expense. The Nazca transformed emptiness into expression. It is also worth noting what the lines are not. They are not defensive. They do not enclose settlements. They do not serve practical infrastructure needs such as irrigation or transport in any conventional sense. They occupy a liminal space between function and symbol. This ambiguity is why they endure as mystery. From a scientific standpoint, the question of how the lines were made is no longer unsolved. Experiments, archaeology, and careful observation have provided clear answers. The Nazca possessed the knowledge and tools necessary to create these designs. What science cannot yet determine is why this method, this scale, this medium was chosen above all others. The act of drawing on the desert floor was deliberate, but its meaning remains elusive. As you imagine standing once more upon the Nazca Plain, you may feel the sun overhead, the heat rising from stone and soil. Beneath your feet lies not just ground, but intention decisions made centuries ago, preserved without explanation. The lines do not resist understanding because they are impossible. They resist because they belong to a worldview very different from our own. In the next part, we will turn our attention to the forms themselves, the animals' shapes and symbols that appear when the desert is seen from above. What was chosen to be drawn, and what might those choices reveal? For now the desert remains quiet, and the lines continue to wait. The shapes that appear from above the desert become something else entirely. What once seemed like an expanse of stone and silence transforms into a vast field of meaning. Lines converge and separate. Curves emerge from straight paths, and gradually unmistakable forms take shape figures that feel both deliberate and strangely delicate against the immensity of the land. This is where the Nazca Lines begin to feel most human. Among the hundreds of geoglyphs scattered across the desert are images that are instantly recognizable. A hummingbird wings spread wide beak extended forward. A spider legs carefully angled body precise and balanced. A monkey, its long tail curling into a perfect spiral. There are birds with outstretched wings, a whale-like figure gliding across the plain, a lizard, a dog, and a human-like form, known simply as the astronaut, gazing upward. Each figure is composed of a single continuous line drawn without lifting, as though traced in one slow, uninterrupted motion. The simplicity of the lines contrasts with the complexity of the forms they create. And yet animals are only part of the story. Far more numerous are the geometric designs, long straight lines stretching for kilometers, trapezoids widening toward the horizon, zigzags, spirals, and rectangles. These shapes intersect, overlap, and sometimes pass directly through the animal figures without apparent concern for preserving their outlines. This layering suggests that meaning did not lie solely in visual clarity. The Nazca did not treat the figures as isolated artworks to be protected from interruption. Instead, the desert functioned as a shared space where multiple expressions could coexist, even if one crossed another. To modernize, this can feel careless. But within the Nazca worldview, it may have been entirely appropriate. Many of the animal figures correspond to creatures that held symbolic importance in Andean belief systems. Birds, for instance, were often associated with the sky rain and divine communication. Spiders were linked to fertility and water, appearing during seasonal changes that signaled agricultural cycles. Monkeys not native to the desert came from the distant jungle symbols of abundance and the unseen worlds beyond the arid plains. These were not random choices. They reflected a world deeply attuned to environmental signs and spiritual associations, yet interpretation must remain cautious. There is no single key that unlocks every figure. Some shapes defy easy classification. Others appear abstract, their meaning lost or perhaps never intended to be fixed. The sheer scale of the figures adds another layer of complexity. The hummingbird measures over 90 meters from wingtip to wingtip. The monkey stretches more than 100 meters across. Such size suggests that visibility from above mattered, but not necessarily in the way modern observers assume. It is tempting to imagine the Nazca attempting to create images meant to be seen by sky beings or deities. But archaeology urges restraint. There is no evidence that the Nazca conceived of aerial viewing in the modern sense. What they did conceive of was ritual movement. Many of the lines forming these shapes show signs of being walked repeatedly. Paths are worn smooth, suggesting procession, ceremonies, or repeated ritual use. The figures may not have been designed primarily as images to be admired, but as spaces to be entered, followed, and experienced through movement. In this sense, the shapes were not pictures, they were performances. Walking a line was an act of participation. Turning at an angle, following a curve, completing a loop, these actions could carry symbolic meaning, reinforcing connection between humans, land, and unseen forces. The geometry of the designs supports this idea. Trapezoids, for example, often widen as they extend outward, guiding movement toward a focal point or distant landmark. Spirals invite inward and outward motion, echoing cycles found throughout nature. Even the straight lines, so stark and uncompromising, may have served as processional routes, direct paths across the desert, linking ceremonial spaces. Importantly, not all figures were created at the same time. Archaeological dating suggests that simpler geometric forms may have preceded more elaborate animal figures. Over generations, the tradition evolved, becoming increasingly complex. This evolution suggests experimentation rather than rigid doctrine. The Nazca were not following a fixed template. They were responding to changing needs, beliefs, and circumstances. The desert once again becomes a record of decision-making. It is also worth noting what the figures do not depict. There are no scenes of daily life. No farming, no hunting, no warfare. Human figures are rare. The focus remains on animals' abstract forms and movement through space. This absence is telling. The Nazca Lines were not meant to tell stories in the conventional sense. They were not narratives carved in stone. They were symbolic gestures, acts of alignment between people and the forces they depended upon. From the air, the lines feel ordered. From the ground, they feel intimate. This duality is part of their enduring mystery. One perspective alone is insufficient. As modern observers, we are drawn to aerial photographs because they offer clarity. But clarity may not have been the goal. Meaning may have resided in repetition, in communal participation, in the act of creation itself, rather than the finished form. And still questions remain. Why these animals and not others? Why place figures where they intersect with lines rather than isolating them? Why choose the desert floor as the medium, knowing how easily it could be disturbed? The answers are not written anywhere. They are embedded in belief practice and a way of seeing the world that cannot be fully recovered. As the sun lowers and shadows lengthen across the plain, the shapes begin to soften once more. From the ground they fade back into abstraction. From the air they remain vivid, silent, and unresolved. In the next part, we will turn our attention to one of the most important figures in the modern study of the Nazca Lines, a woman whose life became inseparable from the desert and whose quiet dedication shaped nearly everything we know today. For now the shapes remain, waiting to be understood. Maria Reiche and a life devoted to lines. When the desert began to reveal its secrets to the modern world, it did not do so all at once, and it did not do so loudly. Understanding came slowly, shaped not by sudden discovery, but by patience, repetition, and quiet devotion. No one embodied this more fully than a woman who would spend nearly half a century walking the Nazca Desert, measuring its lines step by step. Her name was Maria Reiche. She arrived in Peru in the 1930s, trained not as an archaeologist, but as a mathematician and linguist. Born in Germany, she had come to South America seeking work and a different pace of life, unaware that the desert would soon become her lifelong companion. At first, the Nazca Lines were not her focus. They were simply a curiosity mentioned by scholars, visible from the air, faint and puzzling. But as she began assisting researchers with translations and calculations, her attention was drawn repeatedly back to the desert floor. What she saw there did not feel random. The more she walked the lines, the more she sensed structure relationships between shapes, alignments, repetitions that hinted at intention. Where others saw chaos or coincidence, Maria Reiche saw patterns waiting to be understood. She began to measure. Day after day she walked under the desert sun, carrying simple tools, measuring tape notebooks, wooden stakes. She mapped lines by hand, noting angles, lengths, and intersections with meticulous care. Often she worked alone, accompanied only by the wind and the steady rhythm of her own footsteps. This was not glamorous work. It was slow, physically demanding, and largely ignored by the academic establishment for many years. But Maria Reiche persisted. She believed the lines were not merely decorative, but meaningful part of a system that reflected how the Nazca people understood their world. Drawing on her background in mathematics and astronomy, she proposed that many of the lines aligned with celestial events, solstices, star risings, seasonal markers important for agriculture. In her view, the desert functioned as a vast astronomical calendar. Certain lines appeared to point toward the rising sun on specific days of the year. Some figures, she suggested, corresponded to constellations visible in the Nazca sky. The spider, for example, was linked in her interpretation to the constellation Orion, associated with water and renewal in many ancient cultures. Not all scholars agreed with her conclusions. Over time, some of her astronomical interpretations would be challenged or revised, but her broader contribution could not be dismissed. She brought order where there had been confusion. Through careful mapping, Maria Reiche demonstrated that the lines were not haphazard. They followed consistent methods. They showed planning, repetition, and refinement over time. She helped establish that the Nazca Lines were the product of a long cultural tradition rather than a single event or sudden inspiration. Perhaps most importantly, she understood how fragile they were. As roads were built and vehicles began crossing the desert, damage became inevitable. Tire tracks cut through ancient lines. Construction threatened to erase what centuries of dryness had preserved. Maria Reiche responded not with outrage, but with action. She became the line's most tireless advocate. She lobbied the Peruvian government for protection. She educated locals and visitors alike, explaining the significance of the markings and the care they required. At times she used her own modest resources to fund preservation efforts. There are stories of her sweeping the lines by hand, clearing debris to keep them visible, of her camping in the desert, living simply so she could remain close to her work, of her standing beside roads, asking passing drivers to slow down to respect what lay beneath their wheels. Over the years, her dedication transformed public perception. What had once been seen as curious markings became recognized as a cultural treasure. Her efforts laid the groundwork for the Nazca Lines to eventually be designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And yet Maria Reiche never claimed to have solved the mystery. She was careful in her language, aware of the limits of evidence. While she favored astronomical interpretation, she acknowledged uncertainty. She understood that the lines might have served multiple purposes over time: ritual, symbolic, practical, or all at once. What mattered to her was not certainty, but respect. As she aged, her eyesight began to fail. Her health declined. Still, she remained connected to the desert, her life inseparable from the lines she had devoted herself to understanding. When she died in 1998, she left behind maps, measurements, and a legacy of quiet perseverance. She had not unlocked every answer, but she had ensured that the questions would endure. Today, when researchers study the Nazca Lines, they do so standing on foundations she helped build. Modern technologies, satellite imaging, drones, computer modeling, have expanded understanding in ways she could never have imagined. Yet the spirit of careful observation she embodied remains essential. Maria Reiche reminds us that mysteries are not always solved by brilliance alone. Sometimes they are approached by walking slowly, measuring patiently, and listening to a landscape over a lifetime. In the next part, we will explore one of the most compelling interpretations to emerge from decades of study, the idea that the Nazca Lines are deeply connected to water survival and the fragile balance between life and drought in the desert. For now, the desert holds her memory quietly, just as it holds the lines themselves. Lines, water, and survival. In the Nazca Desert, water is never far from thought. Even in moments of calm, even when the sun hangs gently above the plain, the awareness of water or its absence shapes everything. The land offers little margin for error. A single failed season can alter life's traditions and belief itself. For the Nazca people, survival depended on understanding forces that could not be controlled, only respected. It is within this fragile relationship that one of the most grounded interpretations of the Nazca Lines begins to take form. To the modern eye, the desert appears lifeless, but beneath the surface, hidden from view, lies a complex system of underground water channels. These aquifers, fed by seasonal rains in the Andes, made life possible in an otherwise hostile environment. Finding and preserving access to this water was essential. Archaeological research has shown that the Nazca engineered sophisticated systems known as puquios, spiraling access points that allowed communities to reach underground water year-round. These structures required deep environmental knowledge, careful planning, and ongoing maintenance. Water for the Nazca was not accidental. It was sacred. When researchers began mapping the Nazca Lines alongside known water sources, subtle patterns emerged. Some lines appear to point toward mountain peaks associated with rainfall. Others align with underground aquifers or seasonal water flow paths. In certain areas, geoglyphs cluster near places where water would have been especially precious. This does not mean every line marks water directly. The relationship is more nuanced, more symbolic than literal. The lines may have functioned as ritual gestures, offerings drawn into the land itself, intended to invite rain fertility and balance. In a culture where survival depended on forces beyond human control, ritual became a form of communication. The desert floor, vast and open, became a medium for prayer. Ethnographic studies of later Andean cultures provide insight into this worldview. Mountains were seen as living beings. Water was believed to move through the earth like blood through a body. Ceremonies often involved movement across landscapes, symbolic journeys meant to mirror natural cycles. In this context, walking the Nazca Lines may have been as important as drawing them. Processions along straight paths could represent appeals to the mountains. Spirals might echo the movement of water through underground channels. Trapezoids widening toward the horizon could symbolize openness, invitation, or transition. These interpretations do not rely on spectacle. They rely on relationship. Scientific methods have supported parts of this theory without overreaching. Hydrological surveys confirm the presence of water systems beneath regions dense with lines. Archaeological evidence links Nazca religious imagery closely with themes of rain fertility and transformation. Even the animals depicted on the desert floor fit within this framework. Spiders appear during periods of seasonal rain. Birds are messengers between sky and earth. Whales and marine imagery, though far from the coast, evoke abundance and cyclical renewal. The Nazca Lines may not be maps in the modern sense, but they may be symbolic landscapes, ritualized spaces, where the community engaged with the forces that sustain them. And yet this explanation does not answer everything. Some lines extend into areas with no known water connection. Others intersect in ways that seem to ignore hydrological logic. The sheer number of lines, thousands of them, suggests motivations that went beyond immediate necessity. This is where the mystery deepens rather than resolves. It is possible that the meaning of the lines evolved over time. What may have begun as water-related ritual pathways could have expanded into broader ceremonial use. As environmental pressures increased, rituals may have intensified, multiplied, or diversified. Drought cycles in the region are known to have worsened toward the later stages of Nazca history. Environmental stress can reshape belief systems, amplifying ritual behavior rather than diminishing it. In this light, the lines become a record of response, not a single solution, but many attempts. They reflect a society negotiating uncertainty using movement symbol and communal action to restore balance in a world that felt increasingly unstable. Importantly, this theory does not claim the Nazca believed the lines caused rain. Rather, they may have believed that participating in ritual walking drawing, maintaining these paths, maintained harmony with the natural and spiritual forces governing rainfall, meaning resided in participation, not outcome. From a scientific perspective, this interpretation remains plausible because it does not require extraordinary assumptions. It aligns with known cultural practices, environmental realities, and archaeological evidence. It respects the intelligence and adaptability of the Nazca without attributing motives beyond what the context supports. And still, certainty remains elusive. The Nazca Lines do not explain themselves. They do not label which paths were sacred, which figures were invoked for rain, or which rituals were performed where. Much of what we infer comes from careful comparison, cautious interpretation, and acceptance of ambiguity. This ambiguity is not failure, it is honesty. As you imagine standing near one of these lines at dusk, the air cooling the desert quiet once more, it becomes easier to understand why answers remain partial, meaning here was lived, not recorded, experienced, not preserved in words. The Nazca Lines may have been less about being seen and more about being walked, less about image and more about action, less about message and more about relationship. They remind us that knowledge does not always arrive as explanation. Sometimes it arrives as practice. In the next part, we will explore another closely related interpretation that the lines functioned as ritual pathways meant to be walked in ceremony, binding community belief and landscape into a single moving experience. For now the desert remains still, and beneath its surface water continues to move unseen. Ritual pathways and sacred movement. In the Nazca Desert distance changes meaning. What appears close from above can take hours to cross on foot. What seems empty reveals subtle textures, slight rises and shifts in color as you move through it. The land is not passive, it responds to presence. and for the Nazca people movement across this land may have been one of the most powerful forms of expression they possessed. To understand the Nazca Lines as ritual pathways, one must imagine them not as images, but as experiences. Many of the lines are wide enough to walk comfortably. Their surfaces are smoothed, compacted by repeated passage. They do not resemble boundaries meant to keep people out, but invitations meant to draw people in. From this perspective, the desert becomes a ceremonial space, open, expansive, and shared. Ritual movement is a deeply rooted tradition in Andean cultures. Long after the Nazca civilization declined, processions, pilgrimages, and symbolic journeys remained central to spiritual life in the region. People walked to sacred mountains, followed prescribed routes, and reenacted mythic journeys through physical motion. Movement was meaning. The Nazca Lines may have functioned in a similar way. Walking a straight line across the desert could symbolize direct communication with the divine. Turning at precise angles following curves or completing a spiral could enact cycles of life, death, and renewal. The act itself, measured deliberate communal, was the ritual. In this view, visibility from above becomes less important. What mattered was participation. The body moving through space, the rhythm of footsteps, the shared experience of traveling together across a landscape imbued with significance. Some archaeologists suggest that certain lines led toward ceremonial centers like Skywatching or toward prominent natural features, such as mountains believed to control rainfall. Others may have connected ritual spaces now lost to time, erased by erosion or later activity. Importantly, these paths were not random. They were laid out with intention, often aligned with geographic or symbolic reference points. The desert was transformed into a network of meaning-guiding movement in ways that reinforced belief and community cohesion. The trapezoidal shapes scattered across the Nazca Plain offer a particularly intriguing clue. Many widen in one direction, subtly guiding movement outward. When walked, they create a sense of progression, of entering, moving through, and emerging. Spirals, too, invite motion. They draw the walker inward, then outward again, echoing natural rhythms found in water flow, wind patterns, and even human breath. Such forms are not meant to be observed passively. They ask to be followed. This interpretation helps explain why lines intersect and overlap. Ritual landscapes are not static. They evolve. New paths are added as beliefs shift, as communities grow, as needs change. Older routes are not erased. They remain respected even if crossed by newer ones. The desert becomes layered with memory. Walking these paths may also have served social purposes. Rituals bring people together, reinforcing shared identity. In a harsh environment, unity is survival. Processions across the desert would have strengthened communal bonds, reminding participants that they were part of something larger than themselves. Children would have learned the routes by walking them. Elders would have guided movement, recounting stories, invoking ancestors, reinforcing tradition through repetition rather than written word. The lines, in this sense, were a form of education. They taught through movement, and yet not all lines seem equally suited to procession. Some are extremely long, extending far beyond known settlements. Others lead to seemingly empty stretches of desert. This suggests that ritual movement may have had layers of meaning, some communal and public, others symbolic, reserved, or perhaps even personal. Silence, too, would have played a role. The desert amplifies stillness. Footsteps echo briefly, then fade. Voices carry, but only so far. In ritual contexts, this quiet could heighten awareness, focusing attention inward as well as outward. The Nazca Lines may have functioned as spaces where sound movement and landscape aligned, creating moments of heightened presence. From a scientific perspective, evidence for ritual walking comes not from written testimony, but from wear patterns, spatial analysis, and cultural comparison. It is a theory built on convergence rather than proof. And yet it remains compelling because it does not ask the lines to be something extraordinary. It allows them to be human. Human expressions of belief enacted through simple acts, walking, turning, pausing, continuing. Still, questions remain unanswered. Why were certain animals chosen as paths rather than others? Why were some figures isolated while others clustered? Why did some rituals require immense distance while others unfolded in compact spaces? These questions point once again to diversity of purpose rather than singular explanation. The Nazca Lines were not one thing, they were many things unfolding across time. As twilight settles over the desert, the lines soften once more, their edges blurred by shadow. From the ground they dissolve into subtle differences of texture and tone. Only those who know where to walk can follow them with confidence. Perhaps that was always the point. Meaning was not given to everyone at once. It was revealed through participation. In the next part, we will lift our gaze upward again, exploring the long-debated idea that the Nazca Lines were connected to the sky, used to mark celestial events, seasons, and the movements of stars. For now, the desert rests, and the paths remain. Astronomy, skywatching, and the stars. When night falls over the Nazca Desert, the world seems to widen. Far from modern lights, the sky opens completely, revealing a vast canopy of stars. Constellations emerge with striking clarity. The Milky Way stretches across the darkness like a pale river, familiar and yet endlessly mysterious. For ancient peoples, this sky was not distant. It was intimate, cyclical, and deeply influential. It is here beneath this sky that one of the earliest and most debated interpretations of the Nazca Lines took shape. The idea is simple in its essence, that the lines were connected to the heavens. Long before telescopes or written calendars, societies across the world tracked the movements of celestial bodies to mark time. The rising and setting of the sun, the phases of the moon, and the appearance of particular stars guided agriculture, ritual, and seasonal preparation. The Nazca, living in an environment where timing could mean survival, would have had strong reason to observe the sky carefully. Some of the straight lines etched into the desert appear to align with the sunrise or sunset on solstices and equinoxes. Others point toward mountain peaks where celestial bodies rise or set at certain times of year. From specific vantage points, these alignments can be striking. Maria Reiche, whose work shaped much of early research, believed these patterns were intentional. In her view, the desert functioned as a massive astronomical calendar with lines marking important dates in the solar year. Certain figures, she proposed, corresponded to constellations visible in the Nazca sky. The spider, for example, was linked to Orion, a constellation associated in many cultures with water and seasonal change. Birds, too, were thought to mirror star patterns, their wings tracing celestial forms across the land. These ideas captured public imagination, offering a way to connect earth and sky through careful design. But as research progressed, the picture became more complex. Modern archaeoastronomers have applied rigorous statistical analysis to test these alignments. When thousands of lines are considered together, some alignments with celestial events appear inevitable by chance alone. Distinguishing deliberate intention from coincidence becomes challenging. This does not invalidate all astronomical interpretations, but it does urge caution. Some alignments are compelling, others are ambiguous. The Nazca Lines may incorporate celestial references without functioning as a precise calendar in the modern sense. Rather than mapping the sky exactly, the lines may reflect a symbolic relationship with it. In many Andean traditions, the sky was mirrored in the landscape. Mountains corresponded to stars. Rivers echoed celestial paths. The Milky Way itself was seen as a cosmic river linked to earthly water systems. Within this worldview, marking directions associated with the sun or prominent stars would not require exact measurement. Symbolic alignment could be enough. The lines pointing toward mountains may have referenced both celestial and earthly power. A mountain where the sun rose on a solstice was not just a geographic feature, but a spiritual presence, an intermediary between sky and land. Thus, astronomy and ritual are not separate explanations. They overlap. The Nazca Lines may have helped structure time not through calculation, but through experience. Walking a line at a particular moment of the year, watching the sun rise in alignment with a distant peak, participating in a ritual timed to seasonal change, these acts could reinforce cosmic order without requiring numerical precision. This interpretation respects the sophistication of Nazca knowledge without imposing modern expectations of accuracy. Still, questions remain unresolved. If the lines served astronomical purposes, why create so many? Why include animal figures that do not clearly correspond to star patterns? Why allow later lines to cross earlier ones, potentially disrupting alignments? These inconsistencies suggest that astronomy was not the sole function of the lines. It may have been one layer among many. As with water and ritual movement, celestial observation could have been woven into a broader system of meaning. Different lines may have served different roles at different times, reflecting evolving beliefs rather than a fixed system. The Nazca Lines, in this sense, resist reduction. They are not a machine to be decoded. They are a landscape to be experienced. As you imagine standing beneath the night sky now, the lines invisible in darkness, their presence is felt rather than seen. They lie quietly below, aligned with nothing and everything, at once earth-sky memory and movement. Perhaps the Nazca did not seek to measure the heavens. Perhaps they sought to participate in them. In the next part, we will explore another interpretation that builds on this connection between land and belief. The idea that the Nazca Lines were offerings, vast gestures of devotion, meant not for human eyes, but for powers beyond. For now the stars continue their slow passage overhead, and the desert listens. Messages to the gods. In the Nazca world, the boundary between the visible and the invisible was never fixed. Mountains were not inert stone. They were living beings. Water was not merely substance, but spirit. The sky was not distant, but present. Watching, responding, remembered. To live in such a world was to understand that human action carried meaning beyond the immediate moment. Within this understanding, the Nazca Lines may be seen not as messages between people, but as offerings made to forces greater than themselves. Offerings in many ancient cultures were acts of reciprocity. Humans gave time, labor, and devotion in return for balanced fertility and protection. These offerings did not need to be permanent objects. They could be actions, movements, or transformations of space itself. The Nazca Lines transform space. They do not rise upward like temples meant to impress human crowds. They spread outward across the land, quiet and vast. Their scale suggests they were never intended for close inspection. Instead, they seem directed away from human attention toward the sky, the mountains, and the unseen. This perspective helps explain one of the most persistent questions: why make something so large that it cannot be fully seen from the ground? If the intended audience was not human, visibility becomes irrelevant. In Andean belief systems, deities associated with weather, fertility, and the landscape were often imagined as dwelling above within mountains, clouds, or celestial realms. To mark the land in a way visible from those vantage points would be a powerful symbolic gesture. The Nazca Lines may have been prayers drawn into the earth, not spoken aloud, but enacted. The act of creation itself, clearing stones, walking paths, maintaining lines, would have been an offering of effort and intention. The finished form was less important than the devotion embedded in its making. Animal figures fit naturally into this interpretation. Each creature carried symbolic associations. Birds bridged sky and earth. Spiders signaled rain and seasonal change. Marine animals evoked abundance drawn from distant waters. Even abstract shapes may have represented forces beyond human form. To draw these beings across the desert was to invite their presence. The scale of the figures amplifies this invitation. A small symbol might speak quietly. A figure stretching hundreds of meters across the land speaks with the weight of collective labor and belief. Importantly, these offerings were not static. The lines show evidence of maintenance, reuse, and rewalking. Offerings were renewed through participation, not completed once and abandoned. This aligns with a worldview where balance must be continually restored. From a scientific standpoint, this interpretation remains grounded because it does not require advanced technology or extraordinary claims. It relies on known patterns of ritual behavior, symbolic landscapes, and environmental dependence. What it cannot provide is certainty. We do not know which gods were invoked, what words were spoken, or what outcomes were expected. The Nazca left no liturgy, no hymns, no explanations. Only the gestures remain. Some scholars caution against assuming a religious meaning too quickly. Not every ancient construction was sacred, and not every symbol was devotional. Yet, in the Nazca case, the absence of practical utility combined with immense labor investment strongly suggests meaning beyond function. The lines do not transport goods. They do not store resources. They do not defend territory. They give. They give effort, attention, and permanence to an uncertain world. As you imagine standing once more in the desert, the wind lifting dust lightly from the surface, it becomes easier to feel how such offerings might have made sense. When life depends on forces you cannot command, devotion becomes a form of resilience. The Nazca Lines may have helped their creators feel heard, not answered, but acknowledged. And perhaps that was enough. In the next part, we will turn to the ideas that sit at the edges of scholarly consensus, alternative interpretations that arise precisely because the mystery endures, and why careful skepticism remains essential when evidence is incomplete. For now, the desert holds its vast messages silently, drawn not to explain, but to endure. Alternative ideas and careful skepticism. Whenever certainty is absent, imagination moves in. The Nazca Lines, vast and enigmatic, have invited speculation almost from the moment they were fully revealed. Their scale, their precision, and their resistance to simple explanation have made them fertile ground for ideas that stretch beyond archaeology and into the realm of the extraordinary. It is important to approach these ideas not with dismissal, but with calm examination. Mystery does not imply impossibility, it invites care. Among the most widely circulated alternative interpretations is the notion that the lines were created with the help of non-human intelligence, beings capable of seeing from above, guiding construction from the sky. These ideas gained popularity in the mid-20th century, particularly as aviation and space exploration reshaped how humanity imagined perspective and technology. From this viewpoint, the Nazca Lines appear to be something like landing markers, messages, or signals intended for observers not bound to the ground. The appeal of such explanations is understandable. The lines are best appreciated from the air. Their creators had no known means of flight. The leap from mystery to otherworldly assistance can feel intuitive, but intuition is not evidence. Archaeology is a discipline built on material proof tools, methods, context, and comparison. When these are applied to the Nazca Lines, the need for extraordinary explanations diminishes. Experiments have repeatedly demonstrated that the lines could be created using simple tools and careful planning. Cultural context explains symbolism. Environmental factors explain preservation. There is no material evidence, no artifacts, no technologies, no anomalies that require non-human intervention. This does not mean the lines are fully understood. It means they are human. Another category of alternative interpretation frames the lines as purely utilitarian ancient road systems, irrigation markers, or territorial boundaries. These ideas emerged early before the full range of figures was documented. But roads do not form animals. Irrigation systems do not spiral elegantly across open plains. Boundaries do not intersect without regard for separation. These interpretations struggle to account for the diversity, symbolism, and ritual context embedded in the lines. Some theories propose that the lines were a form of social display demonstrations of labor coordination intended to reinforce power structures or communal identity. This perspective is more grounded and in some ways complementary to ritual explanations. Large communal projects often serve multiple purposes. They unify populations, establish shared identity, and demonstrate collective capability. The Nazca Lines could have reinforced social cohesion while also fulfilling spiritual or symbolic roles. This does not reduce their meaning. It expands it. Still, no single theory accounts for every line, every shape, every alignment. This is where skepticism becomes not a barrier, but a tool. Careful scholars resist the temptation to force coherence where none exists. They accept that the Nazca Lines were created over centuries by different groups responding to different needs. Meaning may have shifted, practices may have evolved. Some lines may have lost their original significance even as new ones were added. In such cases, inconsistency is not a problem to be solved. It is evidence of life. The danger of sensational interpretation lies not in curiosity, but in oversimplification. Extraordinary claims can silence quieter truths, the ingenuity of ancient people, the complexity of belief systems, the adaptability of human culture. The Nazca did not need help from the sky to create meaning on the ground. They needed only patience, cooperation, and belief. Science, for its part, does not claim final answers where evidence is incomplete. Instead, it narrows possibilities, tests hypotheses, and accepts uncertainty where it remains. This humility is essential. To acknowledge that something remains unsolved is not to admit failure. It is to respect the past on its own terms rather than forcing it into narratives that satisfy modern expectations. As the Nazca Lines continue to be studied with new technologies, satellite imagery, machine learning, environmental modeling, new patterns will emerge. Some theories will strengthen, others will fade. The mystery will change shape, but it will not disappear, and perhaps it should not. Some creations are not meant to be fully explained. They are meant to endure, to provoke reflection, to remind us that understanding is often partial. As you imagine the desert once more, the lines stretching quietly beneath the sun, it becomes clear that their power lies not in answers, but in restraint. They do not shout their purpose. They do not demand interpretation. They wait. In the next part, we will look directly at what science still cannot fully answer, where evidence ends, where contradictions remain, and why the Nazca Lines continue to resist closure. For now, skepticism keeps watch, and the mystery remains intact. What science still cannot fully answer. Despite decades of study, careful mapping, and increasingly sophisticated technology, the Nazca Lines continue to withhold certain truths. This is not because science has failed to look closely, but because some questions resist resolution when the past leaves no words behind. Archaeology is a discipline built on fragments. It reconstructs lives from objects, beliefs from patterns, and intentions from traces left in earth and stone. With the Nazca Lines, those traces are vast, but context remains thin. We know how the lines were made. We know when they were created approximately. We know who created them. What we do not know is why these choices took the forms they did. One of the most persistent uncertainties concerns purpose. Were the lines primarily ritual, astronomical, social, symbolic, or something else entirely? Each explanation finds support in certain evidence, yet none fully account for all aspects of the landscape. If the lines were ritual pathways, why do some lead to places that appear empty? If they were astronomical markers, why are many alignments imprecise? If they were offerings to deities, why were some figures altered or crossed over time? These contradictions do not cancel one another out. They suggest that the lines may have served multiple functions, sometimes simultaneously, sometimes successively. Another unresolved question involves selection. Why these animals? Why these shapes? Why these locations? The hummingbird, spider, monkey, and bird figures are striking, but they represent only a fraction of the creatures known to the Nazca. Other animals prominent in Nazca art never appear as geoglyphs. This selectivity implies meaning, yet that meaning has not survived in any recoverable form. Similarly, the choice to place lines on the open desert floor rather than hillsides visible from below marks a deliberate departure from earlier traditions. This shift suggests a change in worldview or ritual practice, but its motivation remains unclear. Timing, too, is difficult to resolve with precision. Radiocarbon dating of associated materials places the creation of the lines across several centuries. This means the Nazca Lines are not a single project, but a long process unfolding across generations. Beliefs likely evolved during this time, shaped by environmental stress, social change, and contact with neighboring cultures. What began as one form of expression may have transformed into another, yet the lines remain layered without explanation. There is also the question of why the practice ended. By around 800 CE, the Nazca civilization declined likely, due to a combination of prolonged drought, environmental degradation, and social disruption. Ritual centers like Skywatching were abandoned. The lines were no longer maintained. But why did later cultures in the region not continue the tradition at the same scale? Did the meaning of the lines become lost? Did changing conditions render them irrelevant? Or were they considered complete, no longer needing renewal? Science can suggest possibilities but cannot choose among them. Modern technology has added new discoveries without dissolving the mystery. Satellite imagery and drone surveys have revealed previously unknown geoglyphs, expanding the catalog of forms. Machine learning has identified faint lines nearly invisible to the naked eye. Each new discovery adds detail. It does not add explanation. In fact, the more lines we find, the harder it becomes to argue for a single purpose. Diversity suggests adaptability, creativity, and complexity, qualities that resist simplification. Perhaps the most honest answer science can offer is this: the Nazca Lines were meaningful in ways that do not translate easily across time and culture. Meaning is not universal, it is lived. The Nazca did not create the lines to be analyzed by future scholars. They created them to be experienced within a specific worldview, one shaped by scarcity belief and intimate knowledge of the land. That worldview is gone. What remains is the trace. This does not diminish the achievement, it deepens it. The lines remind us that human expression is not always legible outside its original context. Some creations carry their meaning only for those who walk among them, breathe the same air, and share the same fears and hopes. As you imagine standing at the edge of the desert, now the lines fading into the distance, it becomes clear that mystery is not an obstacle to appreciation. It is part of it. The Nazca Lines do not fail to explain themselves. They choose not to. In the next part, we will turn our attention to the present, to the challenges of preservation, the damage already done, and the fragile future of a landscape that has survived nearly 2,000 years. For now, uncertainty remains, and science waits. Preservation damage and the modern world. The Nazca Lines survived because they were forgotten. For centuries, the desert protected them through neglect. There were no roads crossing the plains, no vehicles cutting across the ground, no heavy footsteps disturbing the fragile surface. Wind passed gently. Rain rarely fell. Time moved slowly, but the modern world does not move slowly. Once the Nazca Lines entered global awareness, they also entered a new phase of vulnerability. What had endured naturally for nearly 2,000 years now faced pressures the ancient desert had never known. The threats are not dramatic at first glance. They arrive quietly through convenience and necessity. Roads built to connect towns, vehicles seeking the shortest route across open land, construction projects that do not immediately recognize what lies beneath. Even a single tire track can permanently scar a line. The desert surface, once disturbed, does not easily recover. The contrast between dark stones and pale soil, the very feature that makes the lines visible, is delicate. When disrupted, it leaves marks that may last longer than the original geoglyphs themselves. Efforts to protect the Nazca Lines began largely through individual dedication. Maria Reiche's tireless advocacy helped shift public understanding, but preservation required institutional commitment. Over time, the Peruvian government implemented protections, restricting access to sensitive areas and establishing designated observation points. In 1994, the Nazca Lines were designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site. This recognition brought international attention, funding, and responsibility. It did not bring immunity. Tourism, while carefully managed, adds pressure. Observation towers offer safe viewing, but increased traffic raises the risk of accidental damage. Climate change introduces new uncertainties. altering weather patterns in ways that could threaten long-term preservation. And then there are moments of human error. In 2014, a small but highly publicized incident occurred when individuals entered a restricted area near one of the figures, leaving footprints that damaged part of the desert surface. Though the intent was not malicious, the impact was permanent. Such events serve as reminders that the lines are not ancient relics locked behind glass. They are part of a living landscape, exposed, fragile, and dependent on continued care. Preservation today relies on a balance between access and restraint. Researchers use drones and satellite imagery to minimize physical presence. Conservationists monitor erosion and unauthorized activity. Education plays a crucial role, helping local communities and visitors understand why these markings matter. Importantly, preservation is not about freezing the landscape in time, it is about respect. The Nazca Lines were never meant to be isolated objects. They exist within a broader cultural and environmental context. Protecting them means protecting the desert itself, its silence, its openness, its rhythms. This includes acknowledging the people who live in the region today. Modern communities coexist with this ancient heritage, navigating economic needs alongside conservation. Sustainable solutions require cooperation, not exclusion. The lines have always been communal in nature. Their survival now depends on communal responsibility. There is also an ethical dimension to preservation. Scholars must decide how much intervention is appropriate. Restoring damaged lines risks altering original features. Leaving them untouched preserves authenticity, but accepts loss. There are no perfect solutions. Each decision involves trade-offs shaped by values as much as evidence. As technology advances, new possibilities emerge. High-resolution mapping allows detailed study without physical contact. Digital reconstructions offer ways to visualize the lines as they might have appeared centuries ago. Yet no digital model can replace the presence of the desert itself. The Nazca Lines are not only patterns, they are place. Standing at the edge of the plain today, you might hear distant engines, see faint traces of modern infrastructure, feel the tension between past and present. The lines remain, but the world around them has changed, and still they endure. They endure because people choose to care. In the next and final part, we will return once more to the desert at dusk, reflecting on what the Nazca Lines ultimately represent and why some mysteries are not meant to be solved but lived with. For now, preservation continues quietly, as it must. The silence above the lines. As the day draws to a close, the Nazca Desert begins to soften. The sun lowers toward the horizon, and the harsh clarity of midday gives way to long shadows that stretch gently across the plain. Colors shift from bright ochre to muted gold, then to gray-blue as evening approaches. The wind, which has whispered across the stones all day, grows quieter still. From the ground the lines fade once more into the landscape. They were never meant to dominate it. If you rise above the desert now, imagining the slow, silent ascent, the vastness of the design reveals itself one final time. Lines extend beyond sight, shapes emerge briefly, then dissolve into the greater pattern. Nothing demands explanation, nothing insists on being understood. The Nazca Lines simply remain. After centuries of study, debate, and careful observation, we are left not with a single answer, but with a deeper appreciation of human expression. These markings are not puzzles to be solved like equations. They are gestures made in faith, in uncertainty, and in hope. They remind us that meaning does not always announce itself. Sometimes it is traced quietly across the earth. The Nazca people lived in a world defined by scarcity and balance. They responded not by building upward, but by reaching outward, transforming empty space into shared expression. Their lines connected land and sky movement and stillness, presence and absence. They did not explain themselves. They trusted time, and time in return has preserved their work beyond expectation. Today we approach the Nazca Lines with tools and theories the creators could never have imagined. Satellites map them from orbit. Computers analyze their patterns. Yet even with this distance and precision, the lines resist final interpretation. This resistance is not failure, it is humility. The Nazca Lines ask us to slow down, to accept that some truths cannot be extracted, only respected. That not every creation was meant to speak across millennia. That some expressions belong fully to their moment, even as they endure beyond it. As night settles over the desert, stars emerge once more, mirroring the countless points of stone below. The sky turns slowly, the lines disappear into darkness, and yet they remain exactly where they have always been, waiting, not for answers, but for attention. In the end, the mystery behind the Nazca Lines may not be what they were meant to say, but what they continue to ask of us: patience, care, and the willingness to listen without demanding conclusion. The desert holds its silence, and within that silence the lines endure.